Hello everyone, in this video I would like to explore the relatively unknown part of the Fallout universe. As all the games are set in the United States, not much is known of what is going on in the rest of the world. As far as I am aware, the Great War consumed the entire world. No country was left spared, and those that were insignificant enough to nuke were left to rot away in the remains of the world. In this video I want to explore the European Commonwealth and its countries, specifically their armed forces and their main combat armor. I have thought a lot about what their main infantry forces would be wearing and what armor was used by each country. Why such a specific niche? I wanted to expand this idea more beyond just their armed forces and combat armor, but time went a little too fast and I wanted to release this video already. There will be a part 2 exploring things more deeply though. I think that the state of the country's armed forces is telling of the mentality of the country and its current economic and general state. Also, it is interesting to speculate and imagine the retrofuturistic designs that European countries might have had. I'm gonna go over some brief lore regarding the EU Commonwealth, and then show you what designs I have made for Britain, France, and Germany. The European Commonwealth was a political union of European states that existed before the Great War. It was formed sometime before 2052, presumably sometime in the late 20th century. In 2052, Europe was heavily dependent on oil imports from petroleum-rich states of the Middle East, and responded with military action to rapidly rising oil prices that were damaging the economy, starting a series of global conflicts known as the Resource Wars. Limited nuclear exchanges in the Middle East resulted in a global panic and fears of global nuclear war. Despite hopes of the United Nations resolving the conflict between the Middle Eastern nations and the European Commonwealth, the war persisted, with the United Nations eventually disbanding by July. Where the Euro-Middle Eastern War came to an end in 2060, the Commonwealth began to dissolve as many countries withdrew from the state. Some European countries continued to export arms to the United States. After years of war, the European Commonwealth was drained, mentally, economically, and spiritually. Closer to the end of the war, the EU would start using cheaper material and more crude methods of production to keep the war machine running, essentially finishing the war in a worse state technologically from where it started. This is something I try to get across in my designs. Although the Commonwealth is unified, each country has its own military and its own doctrine and its own strategy, tactics, and mentality. First design is of the French. France, once a proud and cultured nation, France emerged from the Resource Wars fractured and struggling. Cities were fortified, rural areas cut off from the main centers and abandoned, and rationing became a way of life. The Great War scarred its industrial heartlands, leaving its population weary, some hardened and some broken. Clinging to a broken nation was their last hope. After the Great War, what was left of France survived as a fractured shell of the state it once was, its people holding on to old ideas and some forging new ones, while revolutions simmer waiting for their turn in this cruel new world. Let's go over the standard infantry armor of the French, the CEREB, Combinaison Équipe de Résistance Balistique, which roughly translates to Ballistic Resistance Equipped Suit, something like that. I'm not French, did my best to translate it well, so I hope it gets the point across. Let's go over the lore for this armor system. From the early 2040s to the late 2050s, the European Commonwealth was a political nightmare, fragmented by internal disputes, food shortages, riots, and the beginning of the Resource Wars that spiraled out of control and affected every facet of life in the EU. France was one of the Commonwealth's military powerhouses. It had to rapidly develop its own combat armor system for the campaign in the Middle East, as it was ill-equipped for a large-scale war. The The government contracted the company Armatech Paris to develop a body armor system and supply to the army in relatively short time. The S.T.A.L.K.E.R was the system Armatech had produced and was France's answer to the European Commonwealth's growing militarization. Designed for ballistic resistance against rounds and shrapnel, the semi-heavy armor was adapted and issued en masse. The first batches of the armor were more intricate in their design, but as the war raged on and resources started to dwindle, the quality of the armor plummeted as well, and became more utilitarian and crude over time. The S.T.A.L.K.E.R was meant to provide full-body ballistic and shrapnel protection. It was made from laminated steel on the outer layer, an armored Kevlar lining beneath, and partial NBC protection. The armor was heavy but reliable, and could stop rounds up to 7.62 at a distance. The French doctrine doesn't rely on rocking endlessly through the desert. They rely on vehicles to get from place to place. Because of this style of warfare, they can afford a heavier design of the armor, as it is reflected in the armor's heavier plating on the torso, shins, and forearms. The helmet integrated rudimentary comms and is segmented. The thought behind it was that individual parts getting hit will minimize the damage to the wearer's head. When the Commonwealth collapsed in the late 2060s, most French divisions fortified their own borders and colonies, refusing to obey the Central EU command. This was France's final attempt to assert sovereignty before the Great War annihilated Europe. Post-war salvage sets appear across France and its colonies, often repainted, sometimes found on mercenaries, scavengers, and other factions of the wasteland. I'll show you some stats for the armor. The next design is Britain. Once a patriotic superpower that shaped half of the world, now bears the scars of the resource wars. Weathered and exhausted, its cities persist against hardship, and its people are hardened by decades of scarcity. When Armageddon came, it left swaths of the industrial north of the country in ruin, while southern ports cling to survival. Britons endure with stubborn pragmatism. Some hold onto old traditions and discipline, others adapting to the harsh new barbaric reality, forging paths of survival in a world that has forgotten mercy, while some look for hope by rebuilding the faith of the past amid the chaos. The British Combat Armor Personal Armor System Mark III. By the early 2040s, Britain's personal body armor and equipment were out of date. Previous armor systems were decades out of date. British troops serving in NATO and early Commonwealth operations were taking unacceptable casualties from regular munitions and shrapnel on peacekeeping deployments to the Middle East. After the collapse of NATO in early 2040s and the formal creation of the European Commonwealth, the newly unified Anglo-European Defence Accord pushed for standardization of all field gear. Britain, still not ready to give up its military defense contracts, launched Project ICS, Infantry Combat System, a modernization program built on the lessons learned from the field. The program's mandate: improve ballistic protection, maintain compatibility with European logistics, and the body armor system must remain as light as possible without hindering its protective qualities. The result was the Personal Armor System Mark III, finalized in the early 2050s, a relatively light and modular system. The PAS Mark III was the last armor system Britain has produced before the Great War ended its existence. As the British doctrine relied on maneuvering on foot infantry and long-range missions that required long-distance rucks, a mobile infantry approach to combat, the Brits didn't want the body armor to be too heavy and bulky. They only kept the essential armor on important areas of the torso, head, and upper legs. Because of the large amounts of rocking the troops did, they sometimes removed the leg plates entirely. The construction of the system was straightforward and utilitarian, keeping only what is needed. The uniform also had Kevlar inserts in vital areas to protect the wearer from shrapnel, and the fabric had NBC-resistant liner. When developing the system, the UK was looking at what the Americans have developed, and took inspiration from the US combat armor design. Unlike the American combat armor, Mark I and II, which prioritized mobility and polymer-based plating, the British variant used steel ceramic hybrid plating over a heavy-duty ballistic weave, favoring survivability over comfort. It was heavier than the American armor and provided better protection, but had less surface covered. The Mark III was designed to withstand up to a 7.62 round and low-yield plasma splashes from Chinese weapons encountered in various theaters of war. The British were among the first to make more integrated systems for pouches. A canvas or leather attachment was added to the armor that could hold various pouches. The UK developed its uniform in three main camos: Forest DPM, Desert DPM, and Olive Drab. The Olive Drab was largely phased out by the DPM patterns. After the collapse of the European Commonwealth, surviving units were used by British militias, and later scavenged by post-war paramilitaries operating across the United Kingdom, and even Northern Europe. Rarely one might appear in the wastelands of the United States, as some armors were sent over to the United States for testing, but it's a very rare find. Here are some stats for this armor. The next design is Germany, specifically West Germany. Germany's industrial might made it a central target during the Resource Wars and the Great War. Even divided into East and West, its people and infrastructure remained disciplined and resilient. The Great War reduced much of its urban heart to rubble, yet from the ashes, the West clung to order, rebuilding factories and cities amid irradiated wastelands, slowly expanding eastward. Its population is efficient, pragmatic, and wary of outsiders. The West is being ruled majorly by its surviving army that fights various factions and raiders that are vying for control of the area. The Federal Republic of West Germany emerged as a European Commonwealth's industrial power. While France led on coordination, West Germany built the machines. By the mid-2040s, its defense industries were reborn. Names like Rheinmetall, Heckler & Koch, MAN, and Krauss-Maffei merged under a state direction, forming the Federal Armaments Works, the central manufacturer of all German arms and armor. The naming might sound a bit weird, but I just couldn't pronounce it in German. It's too long of a word, so I'm just gonna show you on screen what it's called, okay? As the resource wars escalated, Germany's industrial sectors were nationalized, and the BVT developed a new standard infantry armor to withstand prolonged combat in various battlefields. A system that could stop the dominant calibers in the battlefield and shrapnel, while also being modular. Pieces can be swapped or added between the heavy variant and the standard armor. The Panzerinfanterie Korpsschutz 02. The literal translation of that would be Armor Infantry Body Protection Model 2. Basically just body armor system number 02. The armor was designed around the German mechanized approach to warfare. The armor was heavy but comfortable, with support for the back and the shoulders to mitigate the weight and spread it more evenly. Its protection was unmatched by anybody in the EU or any of its foes. The standard variation can be worn without any servos. This armor has a layered armor geometry and interlocked plating that could deflect impacts rather than absorb them. While most European designs shifted to more lightweight combination of ceramic and steel, West Germany went all the way, mainly steel, with soft Kevlar padding under, with an extruding soft armor neck protector. Deployment history. Fielded in 2051, the PIK-02 equipped all the Panzer Grenadier divisions of the West German Army. Deployed first in Central Europe for riot suppression and border security, it saw full combat use during the European Commonwealth's Middle Eastern campaigns. where German mechanized units spearheaded assaults on fortified oil sites in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. West German commanders emphasized combined arms, mechanized infantry and PIKO-2 advancing with MBTs and gunships under the doctrine of fire and steel. Even as other nations in the European Commonwealth began to crumble under the weight of the wars, German forces maintained cohesion and discipline, although not for too long, as the war started to grind them down too, and fatigue started to set in the soldiers. It also has a heavy variant. Heavy plates that are attached to a light exoskeleton and beefed up protection of the wearer significantly. It was supplied to the units most likely to be first in combat and depending on the missions. The purpose for the heavy armor was urban and trench assaults. The integrated light exoskeleton allowed the soldiers to carry more heavier weapons, but it was deployed sparingly due to its cost. What happened to Germany post-war? The army took a massive blow in the attacks of the Great War, but a portion of the army hid in bunkers that were prepared just for this scenario. These weren't like the Voltec bolts and could not sustain them for a long time. They were forced to face the wasteland early. The former army was decimated, and what's left of it managed to form a somewhat cohesive fighting force, a shadow of its former self. But through harsh discipline, it got a foothold once again and became one of the main factions that aimed to shape the future of destroyed Germany. They still have access to what's left of their armaments. They had to set production again, to rebuild vehicles, weapons, and personal body armor, as they are the main force that uses it. I'm gonna show you some stats for both armors, the standard and the heavy one. And that's it for this video. Next video is gonna be a bit different. Not gonna be designing anything, but I think of making a video about the designs of Fallout 4 and sharing my thoughts a little bit about them. And see you there. Thank you for watching.